Turn with me in your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 4. We have been looking at the book of Proverbs, thinking about wisdom, what it is. And as we come to Proverbs chapter 4, we learn about this path of wisdom that God sets us on. So I want us to look. It's divided into three sections, and we'll take each one of these sections individually. So look with me in verse 1 of Proverbs 4. It says, "Hear, O sons, a father's instructions, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. When I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Price her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland, and she will bestow on you a beautiful crown." As we come here into Proverbs chapter 4, we see a certain trajectory to wisdom. We are introduced to a conversation. We have seen before in Proverbs in chapter 3 that sometimes the author of Proverbs, Solomon, he addresses his son. He is speaking to the audience like a son. But it uses this language. But now we see a whole nother component to it. Because if you look what's happening, what we have is three generations at work here. He says in verse 1, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction." So there's the father speaking to his sons. But then over in verse 3, "When I was a son with my father," and then in verse 4, "he taught me and said to me." So what we have is this wisdom tradition here. What we have is a father telling a son what the son's grandfather told him. We see this path. We see this trajectory of wisdom. And it is just a reminder that there is something so important about this tradition, about passing along. You know, I tell parents all the time, the question is not whether or not you are teaching your children wisdom. The question is, what kind of wisdom are you teaching your children? All of us, every parent, every grandparent, everyone who is influencing is teaching those around us, here's what's important in life. Everyone is teaching, here is what's valuable. And here, as we come into Proverbs chapter 4, you see that the Solomon is basically, in essence, telling his kids what David told him. He's passing on. And the importance here is that wisdom is time-tested. Wisdom is true. You know, Sarah, matter of fact, again, I've never made any secrets about it. I'm a nerd. I own it. That's fine. I don't care. And I mentioned this morning, my parents are in London, and British history is my thing. I love British history. I don't know why. I just always have. And so my parents talked, and my mom goes, "Oh, we went to the most cool shop today, and we went to this neat little market." And I said, "Yeah, I don't care about any of that." And Mom's telling Sarah, she said, "Sarah, you're going to love this." And I said, "Well, when she reads this list of books that I have given her, then maybe we'll consider going." And Sarah, of course, just rolls her eyes, and she said, "Tanya, you and me can go." And I love history. And part of the reason I love history is because we learn from history. Right? History teaches us valuable lessons. Those, as the old saying goes, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And as we think through history, as we think through, you know, one of the things I look at in my life as I'm a dad is how often I find myself saying things that my dad said to me. My dad really likes efficiency, and so instead of saying things, he would just number his speeches. He would just say, "Speech number 1." Speech number 1 was gravity. It's not just a suggestion, it's a law. And anytime we knock something over, he goes, "Speech number 1." He had a whole bunch of them, and he would say all this stuff, and I find myself saying those same things to Henry. But the funny thing is my dad would say a lot of the things his dad said to him. My grandfather always used to say stuff like, don't jump to a concussion. And I think that's probably a more apt term than don't jump to a conclusion, is don't jump to a concussion. And I mean, there's all this stuff. And you know why my dad repeated stuff his dad said to him? You know why I repeat stuff my dad said to me? It's because there's wisdom there, because there's truth there, because it's beneficial. And Solomon, as he is speaking to his sons, he is helping them see how time-tested, how valuable wisdom is because it lasts. You know, the lessons of the past are still with us today. The things that we learn, you know, one of the things this year is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. 1517, on October 31st, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the castle, or the college church there in Wittenberg, and there's a lot of lessons that we learn from that and that we still need to learn. I'm going to talk about that later this year, because I think that some of the same questions they were struggling with about the very nature of the Bible are some of the same questions we're struggling with today about the importance and necessity of the Bible in our life. And wisdom is so valuable because it lasts, because it's time-tested, because it's necessary. And so you have this, and it's just a reminder to us as parents and as grandparents, as aunts, as uncles, as friends, as neighbors, as anyone who is influencing somebody. We need to continually be passing along good, righteous, God-honoring wisdom. Because as I said at the very outset of this study, there's two kinds of wisdom. And the reality is all of us are passing on one of those two kinds of wisdom at all times. Either we're passing along a heavenly, a Christ-honoring wisdom, or we're passing along an earthly, as James says, demonic wisdom. And as he distills wisdom, he says the same thing essentially twice. There in verse 5 and verse 7, get wisdom, get insight. But he expands it in chapter 7. In essence, he says, whatever you get insight. That is, you hear what he's saying. What is the most important thing in life? What he is saying, what Solomon is saying, what Solomon's saying David was saying, this wisdom that they're passing on, he is saying to his son, whatever you do, whatever you acquire in life, the most important, the most valuable thing you can acquire is wisdom. Get wisdom. Whatever you do, get wisdom. Man, as parents, this ought to be what we're teaching. As grandparents, this ought to be what we're teaching. You know, so often we make our kids focus on things that are part of wisdom but are not wisdom itself. Get an education, get a good job, get money, get success. Again, there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but to have all of those things and to not have wisdom leaves a child set up for failure. If a kid has all the success in the world, a kid has all the money in the world, a kid has all the acclaim in the world, but does not have wisdom, does not have this ability to see things as God sees them, does not have God's understanding of how the world works and what is to be pursued and what is to be shunned. If somebody has all of the things this world values but does not have wisdom, what does it matter? And the Father here is saying, Solomon is saying, whatever you get wisdom. And we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we aren't just saying but are showing is the most important thing in life? Because the reality is we can all say, church is the most important thing, God is the most important thing. The question is not what comes out of your mouth. The question is, what does your calendar show as the most important thing to you? What does your pocketbook, what does your wallet say is the most important thing to you? Because whatever you spend your time and your resources on is what you say is the most important thing. And a lot of Christian parents say God is the most important thing, but they spend very little time with God throughout the week. They say God is the most important thing, but they don't study His Word. They don't seek to grow in it. They say that God is the most important thing, but all their money goes to stuff that doesn't last. They don't serve They don't invest themselves in the things of God. Their kids see them say and do things that run against what the confession of their mouth is. And this is a reminder that what we have to show our children, we have to show our grandchildren, what we have to show those we influence, is that wisdom is the most important thing in life. But notice, Solomon doesn't just say have wisdom. What does he tell us? Get it. There has to be a search. There has to be a pursuit. This is an active thing. Right? If I truly value wisdom, if I truly treasure it, if I truly understand that more than anything else I can get, the thing I need to get the most is wisdom, then I'm going to make a priority of trying to find it. I'm going to make a priority of reading books that will give me wisdom, of listening to sermons that will give me wisdom, of talking to people who will sharpen me so that I'm more wise, and primarily by studying God's Word so that I grow in wisdom. You say, but Michael, here, isn't this contradictory? Because now he's saying get wisdom, he's saying search for wisdom, but earlier he said the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Which is it? It's both. I have to seek wisdom, but I also have to understand that wisdom is a gift. Right? Just by reading the Bible, just by doing all those things does not necessarily entail that I will be a wiser person. I need to be active in seeking to grow in wisdom, but I must never forget that wisdom is a gift, because our tendency as sinful human beings is I'm going to read a whole bunch and I'm going to study a whole bunch and then I'm just going to be a really wise person. And we make it about us. But wisdom can't ever be about us, because wisdom at its core, wisdom at the very foundation of it, is a submission and a surrender to God. And so I have to be active in seeking wisdom, but I have to understand that it's a gift. And if I have to be active in getting it, if I have to go after it, if I have to prize it, then I have to understand it's going to cost me something. To get wisdom is to understand that it will cost me something. Wisdom is free, but wisdom is not cheap. Right? To get wisdom, God freely supplies it. That's what James says. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. God gives wisdom freely, but wisdom is not cheap. Because for me to be wise, for me to grow in wisdom, for me to gain wisdom, I have to surrender myself. I have to surrender my self-sufficiency. I have to surrender my notions of how the world works. I have to surrender my presuppositions, the way I think about what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong. For me to gain wisdom, I have to lose myself. I have to say this isn't about me, and I have to look past myself. You know, so often, even as Christians, we mistake tradition for wisdom. Tradition helps us see wisdom, but tradition is not wisdom itself. And sometimes we have to admit the way we've done things are not wise, and the way we've done things need to change, because the wisdom that God gives us is out there. And so we have to surrender that. It costs us the comfort of just doing the same things the same old way. Sometimes to pursue wisdom means that I've got to change things in my own life, because I realize the things that I'm doing and the priorities that I have are not very wise. We say stuff like, well, I'm just a shy person. I don't like to be confrontational. Or we excuse a lot of sin under the guise of personality. But if I truly want to get wisdom, sometimes it means that I have to surrender. I have to surrender those excuses and say, you know, it may not be comfortable, it may not be natural to me, but wisdom is worth it. Whatever I do in this life, whatever I get, whatever I acquire, I've got to get wisdom. And so we see this trajectory of wisdom that is passed down to us, but that we also ought to be passing down. But the way we demonstrate it, the way we prize it, is shown in how we live, and that's how we pass it on, is by showing others how valuable it is to us, and that whatever it costs us and whatever it means, we seek to get wisdom because that's how much we value it. But then Solomon speaks of the way of wisdom. Look with me in verse 10. Hear, my son, and accept my words. That the years of your life may be many, I have taught you the way of wisdom. I have led you in the paths of uprightness. When you walk, your step will not be hampered, and if you run, you will not stumble. Keep hold of instruction. Do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil. Avoid it. Do not go into it. Turn away from it and pass on, for they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble, for they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. Solomon says it here. I've been saying it. There's two paths. There's two alternatives. We like a third way. We like this third way that says, well, okay, over there's the path of wickedness, and over here's the path of righteousness, but shouldn't there just be a middle path where it's not too risky and it's not too bad and I can just slowly walk it? If you've ever read John Bunyan's classic work, Pilgrim's Progress, that's what Pilgrim's looking for. Right? Is there some other way I can walk? I mean, I don't want to go down the path of destruction, but if I just walk in this grass over here, it'll be a little bit more comfortable. It'll be a little bit easier on my feet. I can stay close to this way of righteousness, and everything will be good. And a lot of times that's what we do as Christians. We look for this third way, but the writer of Proverbs here, matter of fact, the whole Bible tells us there's only two. Jesus says there's only two. There's the broad road that leads to destruction. There's the narrow road that leads to life. That's it. There's two. Not a third road. There's not a detour. There's not some side street. There's not a back alley. There are two paths. And again, Proverbs being poetry, we need to look past just the words themselves sometimes and see kind of what the tenor of the teaching is. And the fact that these two paths are described as ways, as roads, is a reminder that journey, that wisdom is not just this destination, it's a journey, that we don't just arrive at being wise. We don't just say, Lord, help me be wise, and then it's over. We don't just listen to a sermon, or if we read the whole Bible, then all of a sudden we're wise. Only way we get wise, the only way we grow in wisdom is every day, step by step, moment by moment, continuing down the path of wisdom. And Solomon warns his sons. He says there's two paths. You can take the path of destruction, or you can take the path of righteousness. Every step we're taking is down one of those two paths. Every moment. I mean, this is just a reminder of how important every choice and everything we do is. There is no such thing as a casual decision. There is no decision in our life. There is nothing in our lives where we go, yeah, I don't need wisdom. I'm good. Wisdom's only for the big things. Because even in the big things and even in the small things, we need wisdom. And Solomon warns of this path of destruction. The language he uses is very dire. He says, don't go on it. Why? Because they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. They eat the bread of wickedness. They drink the wine of violence. What Solomon is saying here is to go down this path of wickedness is to be enslaved to wickedness. There is not just this casual going through sinful decisions. There's not just this going and making bad choice. Solomon says to go down it is to be ensnared by it, right? The language he's using is these people are so caught up in their sinfulness. They're so given over to their sinfulness that they cannot sleep until they sin. They are consuming sinfulness. The bread that they eat, the wine that they drink, all of it is giving over to sinfulness. And that's the way sin works. Jesus says in John chapter 8, He says, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. See, there's a thing called the law of diminishing returns. The way the law of diminishing returns works is that I do something and I get pleasure in it and I'm satisfied by it, but after a while it ceases to satisfy me. After a while I need something more. I need something bigger. And what sin does is sin is always making us chase the bigger. Sin is always making us chase something more. I think this will satisfy me. I think that I'm just going to be a little bit greedy. I think I'm just going to be a little bit taken over. Got a friend and he got caught up in online gambling and ended up being in debt millions of dollars, literally. And he didn't have millions of dollars. It sounds like he didn't have that at all. And it started with small bets. And I said, man, look, I'm not judging. I'm not condemning. I said, I'm just blown away by this. How in the world do you not just go, oh man, I lost thousands of dollars. I've got to stop this. So how does it get to the millions? And he told me, he said, it started out small. And he said, and I'd get this rush. I'd bet $50, and it gave me this rush. And $50 didn't give me a rush anymore. So then I had to bet $500, and it gave me a big rush. He said, Michael, there's nothing like knowing $500 is riding on whether a field goal goes in or not until you bet $5,000. And it just kept going up and up and up. And that's how so many people, how their sin ensnares them and entraps them. They go down it, and they don't see what they're doing, and they don't see how dangerous it is. But they get to the point that Solomon talks about here where bad decisions, where unwise things are what they consume, and they always have to have more. They always have to have something greater. Well, you don't have to look very far on the news to see here's world leaders, and they can't just have a little bit of power. They always have to have more power. Here's businessmen, and they don't care who it hurts and how it hurts them. They just have to have a few more dollars, and they always need more. And Solomon says that to go down this path is to enter a world of darkness and despair. And again, wisdom helps us see this is bad not after we make the decision. We need wisdom to help us see that it's bad before we make the decision. See, a lot of times that's how we think, is we think, well, I'll try it, and if it doesn't work out, oh well. But that's why God calls us to be wise, is because we need to think about consequences. We need to think about the consequences of our action before we do them, not try and get out of them afterwards. Because when we think about consequences afterwards, again, it just feeds into that notion of things getting bigger and doing more and more. You tell one lie, and then you see the consequence, and you got to tell a bigger lie, and so on and so forth, until you're just caught up in this whole web of them. You do one thing out of anger, and you get your way, and so then you've got to keep pitching bigger fits, and you always make things about you, and you get accustomed to that, and then things don't go your way, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing. See, wisdom says before we make decisions, we need to think about what are the consequences going to be? What kind of path is this going to be taking me down in life? And so you have this path of destruction, but there's another path of righteousness. And he says in verse 18, the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. As a dad, my favorite time of year is when it gets dark real early and the sun doesn't rise up till real late. Because that's Henry's sleep pattern follows the sun. In the middle of the summer, when the sun gets up early, you hear Henry in the other room, "Oh, I'm bored. I hope Mom and Dad haven't forgotten about me. It's 5:30. No one's forgotten about you." You put him to bed and it's 9 o'clock. But Dad, the sun's still out. Right? The way the sun works is it peaks up there at dawn. And what happens until noon? It keeps getting brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter. That's the way the sun works. And Solomon compares the life of righteousness to that. As we go down this path of righteousness, we are like the sun from dawn until noon, that in our life we keep shining more and more and more light. Matter of fact, a better way to be saying it is that we reflect more and more and more light. That as we demonstrate wisdom, as we demonstrate this thing that we have sought, but this thing that is a gift, that people around us see the light of God more and more and more. People see His character more and more and more. That in the way we treat others and in the way that we speak, in the way we relate to our family, in the way we use our resources, that we keep getting brighter and brighter and brighter. Again, the idea is that there is a journey. The sun doesn't just pop up all of a sudden like something out of a toaster and go, "Here I am." It keeps getting brighter. And so it should be with us, that through our lives as we continue and we venture down this way of righteousness, that we are brighter and brighter and brighter. And you keep reflecting that light that God has given us. Again, when you see this is what God is calling us to. But then look with me in verse 20 as he gives this closing stanza. He says, "Put away from you," in verse 20, "My son, be attentive to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape from your sight. Keep them within your heart. For they are life to those who find them and healing to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from you crooked speech. Put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil." Again, I just want us to see something sort of as an observation about the nature of wisdom. A lot of times when we think of God's law and we think of God's precepts, our minds go to the Ten Commandments, and the way the Ten Commandments are framed is don'ts. Don't do this and don't do that. And for many of us, we've looked at the Ten Commandments and we've seen how they're really positive statements, so they're framed with the don't. But for many of us, for many people, that's how we think of God's laws. When we think of the Bible as a whole bunch of don'ts. But you'll notice Proverbs is not a whole bunch of don'ts. Proverbs is not just avoid this and don't do that and don't do this. Proverbs is not telling us what to avoid. Proverbs is telling us what to pursue, because wisdom, it sometimes does need to know what to avoid. But quite frankly, the reality is our problem more often than not is we're pursuing the wrong things. That we are not going after, we're not being intentional, we're not setting our hearts on going after the right things. And because we don't pursue the right things, we have trouble avoiding the wrong things. And so as the father, again, as Solomon is saying to his son, incline your ear to my saying, keep them within your heart. Solomon is not speaking of, here's a bunch of things not to do. Solomon is setting up a value system. Solomon is saying, here's how I want you to think about life. If you want to stay on this path of righteousness, on this way of righteousness, here are some things you have to do. And it begins with thinking about your body. He uses this metaphor of the body, and he speaks of it in 4 stages. And if we want to stay on the path of righteousness, Solomon gives us just some practical advice some things to think about that we need to keep in line in order to stay on that. And so look at what he speaks about with our bodies. He says, first, the heart. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Now again, in the ancient mind, the heart was not the center of the cardiovascular system like we think about it. The heart was the center of one's inner self. It was your mind. It was your will. It was your emotions. All of that is in the heart. So when he is speaking of the inner self here, he's saying you need to guard how you think. You need to guard what you love. You need to guard the priorities you have and how you value things. Why? Because what you love determines what you do. What you value determines what you pursue. What you think about what's right and what's wrong determines how you act. We have it backwards. So often we try and control our actions, but we see throughout the Bible, God looks so far beyond our actions. God looks to our heart. One of the things we've seen over and over as we've been reading in Isaiah, as we've been reading, and we'll be reading in Jeremiah, God is not impressed by our actions. God, matter of fact, he uses strong language in some of the prophets. He says, I hate your sacrifices. Oh, that seems awful strong. God, how can you hate them? I'm doing what you told me to do. But God knows that sometimes we just go through empty gestures. Sometimes we do the right thing, but we do it without the right reason. Or sometimes we even do the right thing and we pervert it for our own selfish reasons. You know, there are people who come to church, and the reason they come to church is because they want to get something from God. They think that if I go to church, God will be more inclined to give me what I want. There are people, and the reason they pray is not to fellowship with the God of the universe, to keep God from getting mad at them. I have to pray, I have to talk to him, he's going to be mad at me. We can do good things and we can still do them for the wrong reasons. Solomon wants us to see that if we want to go down this path of righteousness, it begins by examining our hearts. Because if my heart is corrupt, then my actions are going to be corrupt. If my heart is unwise, then my actions are going to be unwise. If the things I love are not things God values and God treasures, then my priorities in life are going to be skewed. And so Solomon wants us to see that we have to examine our hearts and we have to keep our hearts. Notice he says with all vigilance. You know what that means? We need to always be on guard. We can't let up. We can't think, oh, well, I've been going to church for a long time. Everything's good. I've got this down. He says keep it with all vigilance. Then he talks about our mouth. Put away from you crooked speech and put devious talk far from you. The Bible often, again, when it speaks of the mouth is where the heart comes out. You know, it's amazing that Sarah does not get as cranky when she's driving as I do. You know why? Because Sarah's not as cranky a person as I am. Sarah doesn't fuss the whole, oh, get out of the road. What do you do? She didn't do all that stuff. Why? Because she's just not a cranky person. Her heart's a lot calmer and more at peace than mine is. I can be cranky. And because I'm cranky, sometimes I say cranky things. Again, the problem is not what I'm saying. The problem is what my words are revealing. A lot of times people go through life and, you know, they're just snide with everybody. But what those words reveal is someone who's deeply insecure, somebody who cannot be content in their relationship with Christ, somebody who constantly feels the need to prove themselves, so they have to run down everybody around them. And their words reveal a heart problem. Their words reveal The way they think and the way that they act is not helpful. Right? So Solomon is saying, look at what you're saying. And as Sarah often says to me, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's not just what we say. Look at the tone with which we're speaking. Look at the way we're saying things. What do our words, what does our tone, what do our mouths reveal about us? Because if we want to be on this righteous path and we want to have vigilance on our heart, one of the ways that we're vigilant is by examining, what's my speech say about me? But then he says, let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. You know, it's interesting because in the Bible, the eyes are often the entry point for sinfulness. In Genesis chapter 3, it says, Eve looked at the fruit and it was appealing. Eve looked at it and she thought, oh man, that looks nice. Abraham goes in chapter 12 and he looks to Egypt and it looks appealing. When Lot and Abram, they have the fight over what piece of land, Lot goes and Abraham says, you can pick whatever piece of land you want. And what does Lot do? He looks to where Sodom and Gomorrah is, and it looks appealing to him. When Lot and his family have to leave Sodom and Gomorrah, what does his wife do? She looks back. David is up on the roof, and he should be at war, and David is looking around, and he sees Bathsheba. And all of a sudden, he becomes a murdering adulterer. What starts so harmlessly at our eyes can end so disastrously. What seems so insignificant, and that's why Solomon here is saying, you need to be careful where you're looking. Keep your eyes fixed straight ahead. Don't get distracted with all this stuff. You know, I remember when I was learning how to drive, I did like most teenagers do. You kind of look around and you're looking for girls and, hey, I want to wave at them and my dad's nasty old car and see if I can impress them. And what happens is when you start looking around, the vehicle starts drifting to where you're looking. And so it is with our life, that whatever it is that our eyes are looking at is what our life is going to be moving toward. If we're distracted by money, if we're distracted by power, if we're distracted by pleasure, if we're distracted by status, if we're any of that stuff that distracts us, whatever it is we're focused on is what our lives is going to move toward. That's what Solomon says. Let your eyes look directly forward. Let your gaze be straight before you. That's why the writer of Hebrews says, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith. Right? If my gaze is fixed on Him, if I'm looking straight ahead to Him, I'm not going to be tempted by all these paths of destruction. If I'm looking just at Him, I'm not going to be enticed by all the things of this earth. And then he says in verse 26, ponder the path of your feet, and all your ways will be sure. Do not turn to the right or the left. Turn your foot away from evil. Again, our feet follow our eyes. And can I tell you, I don't know how else to say it, but we ought to always guard where we are and not trust ourselves enough to be in places we have no business being. I think Joseph is the model. When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, Joseph didn't stand there and lecture her on why adultery was wrong. Joseph's feet got him out of there. And sometimes as Christians, I'm not saying it's a sin, but I am saying that we need to be careful to not put ourselves in situations where we can give ourselves over to sin. You know, a lot of times preachers will talk about one specific thing. You know, I've learned that there are some guys and they flip through the television and they see a bunch of women in bikinis and that is what tempts them. But other guys, they couldn't care less. But they change the channel and there's a car commercial and that is when their heart starts going, this is what I have to have, this is what I need. There are some people, some women, and they can go and they can be in the nicest shopping mall and they can look around at all this stuff. And they're tempted, they think, if I can have this, then I'll be somebody. And there are others that can just look at it and think, this is nice, I don't ever need this, I don't ever want this. We all need to realize what sins that we're susceptible to and what temptations plague us, and we need to make sure that we know our heart and we don't look at those things and we don't put ourselves in positions to fall. We need to have the wisdom to think ahead and not let our feet find us in a situation where we are in danger. Again, if you hear, hey, I think I saw Michael the other day. He was climbing this really tall building. Wasn't me. If it was, again, you check me into a hospital in the neurological unit immediately. Because something's not right. I am not going to put myself in that because I am terrified of that kind of situation. Henry and I were watching something the other day and they had guys jumping out of parachutes. He goes, Dad, have you ever jumped out of an airplane? Nope. Well, why not? Because God gave me a brain. Would you ever jump out of an airplane? If it was that or die. But I certainly wouldn't pay money to go do it. Right? Because that's something that terrifies me. We ought to be equally terrified of sin. Jesus said that if your eye offends you, what does he tell you to do? Pluck it out. You go, oh no, that's hyperbole. Is it? Listen, what we ought to do is we ought to have a view of sin that says sin is worse than being blind. Sin is worse than not being able to walk. I'm not advocating that, but we read that and we just automatically go, well, Jesus is just speaking in big terms there. Jesus would never want us to pluck our eye out. No, Jesus would want us to see that sin is so awful and destroys us so much and causes the death that He died. And He would want us to hate it so much that we would rather lose our hands and our feet and our eyes than live in sin. That's how we ought to feel about sin. And if we want to continue on this path of righteousness, we ought to vigilantly guard our heart so that we love the right things. And as we guard our heart, we observe our mouth so that we see what's coming out of us demonstrates that we have the right affections. And as we look forward and we fix our eyes on Christ so that our feet don't wander off and turn to the left or the right and find us in precarious situations, but we keep pursuing God. Well, this week, as I was studying for my sermon and reading, I came across a verse to one of the hymns we sing tonight. We sing that song, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross by Isaac Watts. It's one of my favorite hymns. And there's a verse, the original fourth verse that Isaac Watts wrote, apparently not too long after he wrote it, stopped being used. I went and asked David, I said, what's the oldest hymn you have? I just started researching, trying to figure out when did people stop singing this? Because I love what this verse says. Listen to this verse. He says, His dying crimson like a robe spreads o'er His body on the tree. Then I am dead to all the globe, and all the globe is dead to me. I love that. And that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is seeing what Christ did for me. What Christ did in my place. And realizing all the world is dead to me. And none of the things that this world offers, no path that this world calls me to, is going to please me and is going to satisfy me as much as my eyes fixing on Him, my heart beating for Him, so that my mouth praises Him as my whole life is spent moving towards Him, so that for eternity I can sing His praises and rejoice with Him forever. May we live out wisdom like that. It says all this globe, all this world is dead to me because Christ has given me life. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, Lord, we thank You so much for the gift of wisdom, and we thank You for what You have provided for us. But Father, I pray that we spend our lives seeking it, that we pursue it, seek to attain it and grow in it, that we pass it along, that God, that we are vigilant over our hearts and our lives. Father, we thank You so much for Christ who came and who lived and who died for us, who has given us life by His death. Father, I pray that the life we live is lived well and is lived to glorify You. Father, as we sing this song of commitment, as we think through what You are teaching us and what You are showing us, Father, may we all commit ourselves to spend every moment of every day of our lives journeying down this path of wisdom and righteousness, fixing our eyes on You. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.